Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1930s, was a city that ran on noise. Not the kind of noise you hear in a crowded cafe, or the kind that feels alive and warm. This was industrial noise, steel and rail and engines and machinery. It was the sound of work being forced out of people, the sound of progress scraping against the human body. On some mornings, the sky looked less like weather and more like residue. Smoke from factories drifted above the neighborhoods and lingered as if it had nowhere else to go. Soot settled on windowsills. The air carried the metallic bite of industry, and even the streets seemed to wear it. Darkened brick, stained stone, worn wood, everything dulled by labor and time. But the noise didn't mean stability. Not then. Because this was also Cleveland during the Great Depression, when the city's strength became its weakness, when the industries that built it began to buckle, when factories slowed, when jobs disappeared, when the future stopped feeling inevitable and started feeling like a rumor. In that kind of world, a person could fall out of the system quickly. Someone would lose work, then lose their apartment, then lose their address, then lose the habit of being seen. The city still moved, but it moved around them. It stepped over them. It looked through them. And Cleveland had places where the overlooked gathered, places where hardship pooled like rainwater. One of those places was Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run wasn't a neighborhood in the way people meant when they talked about their block or their community. It was a rugged valley and watershed cut through the city, carved by old water and later dominated by rail lines and industry. It functioned like a scar, slicing between districts, a broad arc of land where the city's infrastructure crowded in. Tracks, bridges, industrial sites, and the constant passage of trains. By the 1930s, it had become more than geography. It had become a hiding place. Not a secret one, people knew it was there, but a place polite society didn't like to imagine in detail. During the Depression, poverty surged, and Kingsbury Run became associated with makeshift communities, shanties, and transient camps pressed into the valley and along the rail corridors. If you lived a conventional life in Cleveland, Kingsbury Run was something you drove past without slowing down, something you crossed on a bridge without looking down, something you referred to vaguely, like it was a rumor the city told itself, never quite finishing the sentence. But people lived there. People who had slipped out of normal routines. People without steady work, without stable housing, sometimes without family nearby, sometimes without anyone who could insist loudly that they mattered, and that detail, quiet, almost bureaucratic, matters more than most people want to admit, because in a city like that, in a decade like that, a person could disappear in a way that didn't immediately become a crisis. Not because nobody cared, because caring was stretched thin. Cleveland in the 1930s was not a city with extra attention to spare. There were simply too many problems at once. Too many families struggling. Too many men standing in line for work. Too many people trying to hold their lives together with whatever they could find. And when a city becomes exhausted, it changes. Not all at once, not dramatically. It changes in small decisions, in what gets ignored, in what becomes normal, in what people stop asking about because the answers are too heavy. Kingsbury Run was one of those places where the city learned to look away. And when a city looks away, it creates a blind spot, a dark pocket where the rules don't apply as strictly, where a person can move differently, where a predator can exist without triggering alarms, because the alarms weren't set up to notice what happened there. That's the part that makes this story so unsettling. Not just that there was a killer, but that the environment made it possible for a killer to operate like a ghost. Because Kingsbury Run wasn't only poverty, it was movement. Trains and tracks and transients, people coming and going, people sleeping in temporary shelter, people who might not be listed in any neat system, who might not have official paperwork up to date, who might not be reported missing quickly or at all. It was a place where identity could blur, and when identity blurs, accountability blurs with it. In a case like this, the mystery isn't only who did it. It becomes, how did someone do this for so long without being stopped? The answer begins here, in the simple fact that Cleveland had places where people could vanish quietly. To understand how fear spread later, you have to understand what came first. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the administrative kind. The kind where an absence doesn't make the front page. The kind where someone doesn't show up for work, but they didn't have steady work anyway. The kind where someone doesn't come home, but they didn't have a fixed home. The kind where someone stops being seen, and the city absorbs it like one more loss in a decade built from losses. And that is exactly the kind of environment an unknown predator needs. Someone who doesn't want attention. Someone who doesn't want witnesses. Someone who doesn't want the kind of victims who will instantly set an entire police department on fire with urgency. Someone who understands, maybe instinctively, maybe deliberately, that there are parts of a city where you can do terrible things and the world won't snap to attention right away. For a while, Cleveland didn't recognize what it was dealing with, because the earlier signals didn't feel like a single story. They felt like fragments, scattered incidents, rumors, discoveries that were disturbing, but not yet connected in the public mind. The records and timelines around this case are complicated, and different sources frame the beginning differently. Some accounts trace the earliest known victim discovery to 1934, while many official summaries focus on the main series of murders that drew intense attention from 1935 through 1938. But either way, what matters for the story is this. By the mid-1930s, something was happening in Cleveland that didn't fit the city's usual pattern of crime. This wasn't a robbery gone bad. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't a personal dispute that escalated into tragedy. This was something colder, something methodical, something that suggested a person or persons who could separate human life from human meaning and do it with frightening calm. And Cleveland wasn't prepared for the emotional shape of that, because serial predators weren't a household concept yet. The language people use today, profiling, patterns, signatures, didn't exist in the same way. Investigations still relied heavily on witnesses, confessions, obvious motives, and predictable human behavior. But what do you do when the killer behaves like a void? When the victims are hard to identify? When the witnesses don't exist? When the location itself swallows evidence? That's the nightmare geometry of Kingsbury Run, a place built to conceal even when no one intended it to. At first, the city reacted the way exhausted systems often react, with distance, with denial, with the hope that it was an isolated horror, the kind of thing you can label as an aberration and then move on from. But Cleveland couldn't move on, because the discoveries didn't stop, and slowly the city's emotions began to change, not into full panic, not right away, but into something heavier, suspicion, the sense that something was moving through Cleveland, not as a sudden storm, but as a quiet presence, a lurking intelligence, the sort of threat that doesn't announce itself, the sort of threat that waits. One of the most chilling aspects of this case, even when you strip away every sensational detail, is that it didn't need spectacle to terrify people. It didn't need a public scene. It didn't need a dramatic confrontation. All it needed was repetition, because repetition turns a tragedy into a pattern, and a pattern turns into a fear that can live anywhere. And fear like that doesn't stay in Kingsbury Run. It leaks upward. It climbs the bridges. It follows the tracks. It slips into neighborhoods that had previously convinced themselves they were safe. The press played its role, as it always does when a story refuses to behave. When horror isn't neatly contained, it becomes a kind of public obsession. The murders became known by names that turned the killer into a figure, an idea, something the city could fear even when it didn't understand it. But before the headlines, before the city's collective paranoia, before the theories and suspects and rumors, there was a more uncomfortable truth. Cleveland had a hole in it, a place where the city's attention did not fully reach, a place where the vulnerable gathered, a place where people could disappear quietly, and in that hole, someone found room to operate. As the case escalated, Cleveland would eventually turn to famous leadership. Eliot Ness, the lawman known for his earlier work against organized crime, was brought in as Cleveland's safety director in December 1935, overseeing public safety in the city while this nightmare was unfolding. To the public, that kind of name represented hope, a narrative, the idea that the right person could arrive and impose order. But the truth was more disturbing than that, because this wasn't the kind of enemy you could corner easily. This enemy didn't stand in the light. This enemy didn't demand recognition. This enemy didn't leave a clear trail back to a normal life. An unknown predator doesn't rely on power the way a politician does, or money the way a criminal enterprise does, or influence the way a corrupt official might. An unknown predator relies on invisibility. And Cleveland, in the 1930s, was a city with plenty of shadows. Kingsbury Run was full of them. The bridges cast them, the trains carried them, the valley held them, and the city, busy and struggling and exhausted, didn't realize what those shadows were hiding until it was far too late to pretend it was just another problem. Because then came a discovery that didn't stay quiet. A discovery that snapped Cleveland's attention toward Kingsbury Run in a way it couldn't undo. A discovery that would become one of the first widely recognized moments in a chain of murders that the city would never truly solve. And once that door opened, the fear that stepped through it didn't leave. It became a presence, a lingering stain on Cleveland's history, a story that still refuses to end cleanly, because it never gave the city what it wanted most: a face, a name, a person to point to and say, that's the reason. Instead, it gave them something worse: a blank space where the killer should have been. And in the 1930s, in a city already struggling to survive, that blank space felt like something alive. By the mid-1930s, Cleveland was already a city accustomed to hardship. People had learned to live with uncertainty, to live with loss, to live with the quiet disappearance of neighbors who simply drifted away in search of something better. But there is a difference between absence and intrusion, between someone leaving and something arriving. The moment Cleveland's unease began to crystallize into fear did not come with sirens or public spectacle. It came quietly, the way many nightmares begin. In September of 1935, 2 boys were walking near Kingsbury Run. There was nothing remarkable about the day itself, nothing that hinted at the city's future. Children wandered everywhere in those years: rail yards, empty lots, forgotten stretches of land carved between industry and neglect. Curiosity has always drawn the young toward places adults prefer not to examine too closely. Kingsbury Run was one of those places. A landscape of dirt paths, brush, discarded debris, and the constant presence of railroad tracks cutting through the valley like veins of steel. For the boys, it was simply terrain, another piece of the city to explore, until they saw something they did not understand. At first, it did not register as horror. It rarely does. The human mind resists conclusions that feel impossible. Shapes are mistaken for objects. Objects are mistaken for refuse. Refuse is mistaken for nothing at all. But confusion eventually gives way to recognition, and recognition changes everything. Authorities were notified. What investigators encountered that day was not merely a crime scene. It was an anomaly, something deeply unsettling not only for what it represented, but for what it refused to explain. There was no obvious struggle to reconstruct, no clear narrative of events, no witnesses stepping forward with urgent testimony. Instead, there was a profound absence of context. Identity could not be immediately established, and that detail, more than any other, quietly transformed the investigation into something far more troubling. Because when a victim has no clear identity, a case loses its anchor. No history to examine, no relationships to map, no recent conflicts to scrutinize. The normal architecture of a murder investigation simply collapses. Who was this person? Where had they come from? Who had last seen them alive? Questions that typically guide detectives toward answers instead spiraled outward into uncertainty. And Cleveland, though no stranger to violence, was not prepared for that particular kind of void. This was not just a killing. It was a puzzle with missing pieces. Pieces that may never have existed in any reliable record. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do. Kingsbury Run was already a place wrapped in social discomfort, associated with poverty, transient populations, and lives that existed outside conventional structures. The discovery fed into something darker, a sense that danger itself might be living in the valley, not as a sudden outbreak of chaos, but as a presence that had been there all along, unnoticed. In the early days, officials struggled with classification. Was this an isolated event, an inexplicable but singular act, or something worse, the first visible fracture in a pattern not yet understood? The city wanted reassurance. Cities always do. They prefer the language of exceptions, of rare tragedies, of incidents unlikely to repeat, because repetition demands a far more terrifying conclusion: that someone is choosing, that someone is acting with intent, that someone remains free. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and Cleveland's hope for containment began to erode, because Kingsbury Run did not surrender only one mystery. It offered another, then another, each discovery layering unease upon unease, dread upon dread. The similarities between the cases, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, forced investigators toward a chilling realization. These were not random acts. not disconnected tragedies. There was a pattern emerging from the shadows of Cleveland. A pattern defined less by what was known and more by what remained absent. No clear witnesses, no obvious suspect moving through traditional channels of suspicion, no dramatic confrontations, only victims, appearing like messages without authors. The newspapers seized upon the developing horror, language sharpened, headlines darkened. The city's imagination began to transform the unknown into something almost mythic, a predator without face or identity. Fear thrives in ambiguity. A known threat can be described, categorized, mentally contained. An unknown threat expands endlessly. Anyone could be responsible. Anywhere could be dangerous. Anyone could be next. Cleveland began to change. Not visibly, not overnight, but psychologically. Conversations shifted. People lingered a little less comfortably in isolated areas. The valley of Kingsbury Run, once merely a symbol of economic despair, now carried a more primal association. Something hunts here, and perhaps more disturbing. Something leaves without being seen. Investigators faced a compounding nightmare. Many victims were difficult to identify, drawn from populations already living at the margins. Transient workers, drifters, individuals whose movements were poorly documented. The killer, whether by design or intuition, had found the perfect hunting ground. A place where disappearance did not instantly trigger alarms, where identity itself was fragile, where the dead did not immediately speak through records and family demands. In ordinary homicide cases, investigators work backwards from the victim. In Cleveland, detectives were often forced to work forward from almost nothing. The psychological toll of such cases is difficult to overstate. Every discovery intensified the same questions. Who is doing this? How are they selecting victims? How are they moving undetected? And most terrifying of all, are they still here? With each passing month, the city's fear matured. No longer shock, no longer disbelief, but a slow-burning dread rooted in inevitability. Because once a pattern becomes undeniable, the future itself begins to feel poisoned. People no longer ask whether another victim will appear. They ask when, and where, and who. Cleveland's unknown predator had achieved something profoundly destabilizing. Not just violence, but psychological occupation. The sense that an unseen intelligence was operating within the city's boundaries, indifferent to authority, indifferent to fear, indifferent to the frantic efforts of law enforcement. Invisible killers exert a unique kind of terror. They do not merely threaten life, they threaten comprehension. They deny society its most basic reassurance that terrible acts have understandable causes, identifiable perpetrators, solvable narratives. Instead, Cleveland confronted something far more disturbing. A killer who behaved like an absence, a force moving through the city without leaving a face behind. By late 1935, the situation could no longer be treated as a series of isolated tragedies. The scale of the mystery, the mounting public anxiety, and the inability to produce meaningful leads demanded a new level of response. And Cleveland would soon place its faith in a man whose reputation suggested he could battle even the most elusive enemies, a name already etched into American law enforcement legend, a man believed capable of restoring order where others had failed. But Cleveland's nightmare was not a bootlegger network, not organized crime, not an enemy that feared exposure. This enemy thrived in darkness, and darkness does not surrender easily. Act 3 begins when Eliot Ness enters a city already haunted and discovers that the predator he faces does not behave like any criminal he has ever pursued. By the time Cleveland fully grasped the nature of its crisis, fear had already taken root. Not the sudden, explosive fear of catastrophe, but the slower, more corrosive kind. The fear that grows from repetition. The fear born not from a single terrible event, but from the realization that the terrible event is not finished, because the discoveries did not stop. They continued with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, each new victim deepening the same dreadful conclusion. Cleveland was not witnessing isolated acts of violence. It was witnessing continuity. Somewhere within the city, an individual was operating with chilling consistency. The press struggled to describe what was happening. Language itself seemed inadequate. Newspapers rely on clarity, names, motives, identifiable villains. But Cleveland's killer offered none of those comforts. There was no manifesto, no taunting letters, no dramatic claims of responsibility. Only bodies appearing without explanation, linked by disturbing similarities, yet severed from the usual pathways of investigation. And so, the city began to invent its own mythology. When people cannot see a threat, they imagine one. Rumors spread through Cleveland like a second atmosphere. Conversations lowered to uneasy tones in diners, streetcars, barrooms. Everyone seemed to know something, yet no two accounts ever aligned. Some believed the killer must be a transient, drifting along the rail lines, invisible because he never stayed in one place. Others insisted the opposite, that the murderer had to be local, someone embedded in the city's routines, someone who understood Cleveland too intimately to be an outsider. Whispers of a mad doctor circulated, speculation about secret cults, dark suspicions cast toward Kingsbury Run itself, as though the landscape could produce violence by its mere existence. Fear, once unleashed, rarely obeys reason. What made the situation uniquely terrifying was the absence of contradiction. No arrest disproved the theories. No definitive suspect quieted the panic. No coherent narrative restored psychological order. Instead, Cleveland existed in a state of suspended explanation. A city attempting to function while haunted by an unanswered question. Who is doing this? And more urgently, how are they doing this without being seen? The victims themselves compounded the nightmare. Many remained unidentified. In typical homicide cases, identity provides structure. It offers detectives a starting point, relationships, histories, patterns of movement. But Cleveland's investigations often began with unsettling blankness. No immediate family demands, no clear social circle, no obvious chain of last sightings. The killer had, intentionally or not, selected from the margins of society. Individuals whose disappearances did not immediately generate citywide alarm. This created a deeply destabilizing dynamic. The public knew a predator existed, but the predator's movements were impossible to trace because the victims' lives were difficult to reconstruct. It was like chasing a shadow cast by another shadow. Authorities faced mounting pressure. Every new discovery carried not only investigative challenges, but political consequences. Confidence in public safety eroded with each headline. Citizens demanded reassurance that officials could not honestly provide, because there was no visible progress, no clear suspect, no narrowing field of possibilities, only an expanding sense of vulnerability. And yet, paradoxically, daily life continued. Factories operated, streetcars ran, Shops opened and closed. Cleveland moved, even as dread seeped into its foundations. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of prolonged terror. The coexistence of routine and horror. The knowledge that somewhere within the same city grid, ordinary life and unimaginable violence occupy the same hours. At night, the anxiety sharpened. Darkness has always amplified human fear, but now Cleveland's nights felt charged with something more specific. Every unfamiliar sound carried implication. Every solitary figure invited suspicion. People began altering behaviors in subtle ways, avoiding certain areas, questioning unfamiliar faces, watching strangers with new intensity. But vigilance offers little comfort against an enemy defined by invisibility. The killer did not behave like the villains people understood. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public rampages, no escalating theatrics, only the steady, methodical appearance of victims, which implied something profoundly disturbing. Control. Random violence often appears chaotic, driven by impulse or desperation. But Cleveland's unknown predator projected patience, calculation, the sense of someone operating according to an internal logic inaccessible to everyone else. And worst of all, successful evasion. Months passed. Investigators pursued leads that dissolved into ambiguity. Persons of interest emerged, only to collapse under insufficient evidence. Suspicions shifted like sand, never solidifying into certainty. Each failure fed the same haunting conclusion. The killer was still out there, still moving, still choosing, still unseen. The psychological toll on the city intensified. Unsolved violence exerts a unique pressure on collective consciousness. A solved crime, however horrific, possesses boundaries, a beginning, a perpetrator, an end. But an unsolved predator generates endless possibility. Anyone could be responsible. Anyone could be targeted. Anywhere could become a crime scene. Cleveland was not merely confronting murders. It was confronting uncertainty weaponized. The newspapers, reflecting and amplifying public fear, adopted language that transformed the unknown into something almost mythic. A faceless entity stalking the city. A figure both real and unimaginable. An enemy without identity becomes an idea. And ideas are far harder to contain. By late 1935 and into 1936, the pattern had become undeniable. This was not coincidence, not statistical anomaly, not a string of disconnected tragedies. Cleveland had a serial killer. Though the term itself was not yet common, the reality was unmistakable. Repeated murders linked by distinctive characteristics, committed by an offender who remained unidentified and at large. The scale of the crisis demanded extraordinary response. City officials needed more than detectives. They needed a symbol of competence, a figure capable of restoring public confidence. And Cleveland believed it had found one. Eliot Ness. His reputation preceded him, the relentless prohibition agent associated with the downfall of Al Capone, a man whose name evoked precision, discipline, and incorruptibility. To a frightened public, Ness represented something vital: hope. The belief that expertise could penetrate mystery, that logic could defeat terror, that Cleveland's invisible predator could finally be dragged into the light. But reputations are built on familiar battles, and Cleveland's enemy was anything but familiar, because Ness was not stepping into a conventional investigation. He was stepping into a void, a killer who left no clear trail, no reliable witnesses, no obvious motive, no easily traceable victims, an adversary who did not behave like organized crime, did not negotiate, did not threaten, did not boast, only vanished. When Eliot Ness took command of Cleveland's public safety apparatus, the city wanted certainty, not optimism, not reassurance, certainty. His name carried weight, a kind of institutional mythology forged during an earlier era of American crime. Ness was associated with structure, discipline, and the defeat of enemies that seemed untouchable. He'd become, in the public imagination, a man who imposed order on chaos. But Cleveland's nightmare did not resemble anything Ness had faced before. Organized crime, for all its power, obeys recognizable rules. It operates through networks, hierarchies, incentives. It leaves trails of money, alliances, rivalries, human weaknesses that investigators can exploit. The Cleveland murders offered none of that architecture. There was no organization to infiltrate, no financial motive to trace, no internal conflict to observe, only a sequence of killings bound by pattern yet severed from identity. Ness inherited a case defined by absence. No definitive suspect, no coherent explanation, no reliable path forward. And perhaps most dangerously, a public whose fear was metastasizing faster than any investigation could progress. The psychological climate of Cleveland had shifted dramatically by the time Ness fully engaged with the murders. Anxiety was no longer confined to Kingsbury Run or the margins of the city. It had seeped into everyday conversation, into the quiet calculations people make about safety and risk. An invisible predator does not simply terrify individuals, it destabilizes trust itself. Anyone might be responsible. Anyone might be hiding something. Anyone might not be what they seem. Ness approached the crisis with urgency, mobilizing resources, coordinating investigative efforts, pushing for leads that could transform speculation into evidence. But from the outset, the investigation resisted momentum. Traditional methods yielded little. Witnesses were scarce or non-existent. Victim identification remained inconsistent. Physical evidence failed to converge toward a clear perpetrator. Each discovery generated headlines. Each headline intensified public pressure. And yet, each investigative avenue seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. The killer behaved with unnerving precision, not theatrical, not erratic, but methodical. The murders suggested planning, control, and a chilling understanding of how to avoid detection. There were no obvious mistakes, no careless exposures, no impulsive deviations that might narrow the field of suspects. For Ness, this presented a uniquely infuriating adversary. Not merely a murderer, but a murderer who seemed to operate beyond the reach of conventional detection. A phantom moving through Cleveland's blind spots. The press amplified every development, speculation flourished, and inevitably, suspects emerged. Among the most persistent threads of suspicion was a man whose profile seemed to invite both fascination and dread. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a physician with a troubled history, known to struggle with alcoholism and mental instability, and whose name would become inseparably entangled with theories about the murders. on.wikipedia.org/wiki/Cleveland_torso_murderer. Sweeney occupied a peculiar space in the investigation. He was neither an anonymous drifter nor an easily dismissed eccentric. He possessed medical training, intellectual capacity, and characteristics that, to some investigators, aligned disturbingly well with the perceived sophistication of the killer. But suspicion is not proof, and proof remained elusive. Sweeney underwent questioning, scrutiny intensified, rumors multiplied. Yet the evidentiary threshold required for decisive action refused to solidify. This tension between intuition and verification haunted the investigation. Law enforcement often develops instincts about individuals, about behaviors, about patterns that feel significant. But criminal justice demands more than intuition. It demands demonstrable connection, facts capable of surviving legal examination. In Cleveland, facts were maddeningly scarce. The killer, whoever he was, had constructed a reality where certainty constantly retreated. As months passed, Ness confronted a dilemma that strikes at the heart of unsolved predator cases. How do you stop an enemy you cannot see? How do you neutralize a threat that leaves no reliable path to its origin? How do you reassure a terrified public when every investigative milestone collapses into ambiguity? Frustration mounted, pressure intensified, and Cleveland's sense of vulnerability deepened. One of the most controversial moments associated with Ness's tenure arose from a drastic measure aimed not directly at the killer, but at the environment believed to shelter him. Eventually, the killing stopped. Not with spectacle, not with an arrest broadcast to a relieved public, not with a confession that could be dissected, analyzed, and archived. They simply ceased. And in some ways, that was more disturbing than anything that had come before. Because when violence ends without explanation, fear does not disappear with it. It lingers, suspended in uncertainty, refusing to settle into memory. Cleveland had spent years living beneath the psychological weight of an invisible predator. Years of headlines, years of speculation, years of investigators chasing patterns that never led to a courtroom. And then, without warning, the pattern broke. No definitive announcement marked the end. No singular moment declared the threat extinguished. Only the gradual realization that new victims were no longer being discovered. For some citizens, the silence brought relief. For others, it produced an entirely new anxiety. Serial predators do not retire politely. They are stopped, or they continue. And Cleveland had no proof that its killer had ever been stopped. No body, no conviction, no undisputed identity, which left the city confronting a uniquely unsettling possibility: that the murderer had not been defeated, only interrupted. Theories multiplied in the absence of answers. They always do. Human beings possess a deep intolerance for unresolved terror. We crave structure, causes, motives, endings that allow us to categorize horror as something understood and contained. But Cleveland's case resisted containment. Among the most enduring suspicions remained Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a man whose name drifted through the investigation like a persistent shadow, alternately framed as a deeply troubled individual, a compelling person of interest, or a convenient focus for a mystery desperate for a face. Some investigators believed Sweeney fit too many unsettling criteria to ignore. Others insisted the evidence never crossed the threshold required for certainty. Even Eliot Ness himself reportedly maintained private convictions about Sweeney's potential involvement. Yet convictions without proof carry no legal force. Suspicion cannot substitute for evidence, and evidence capable of closing the case never materialized. Sweeney was never convicted of the murders. The killings were never conclusively tied to any single perpetrator, which is the detail that transforms this story from tragic to profoundly unnerving. Because history typically grants distance from horror through explanation, We tell ourselves that terrible events belong to identifiable actors, that monsters wear human faces, that the past can be safely examined because its dangers have been named. But Cleveland's unknown predator was never named, never fully defined, never placed within the comforting boundaries of resolution. Instead, the case dissolved into legend, into archival fragments and investigative debates, into a lingering question mark embedded within the city's history. And unanswered questions possess a peculiar durability. They do not fade the way solved stories do. They persist. Decades passed. Generations changed. Cleveland modernized, its industrial landscape evolving, its neighborhoods reshaped by time. But the mystery endured. Whoever committed the murders had achieved the ultimate evasion. Not merely avoiding capture, but avoiding identity itself. No trial, no final reckoning. No moment where society could look upon the killer and say, with certainty, there. That absence has fueled endless reinterpretation. Was the murderer a lone predator? A transient drifting invisibly along rail corridors? A local resident hiding behind an ordinary life? Multiple offenders whose crimes were later woven into a single narrative? Each theory attempts to impose logic upon something that stubbornly resists it. And perhaps that is the most disturbing element of all. Not simply that horrific crimes occurred, but that the mind can never settle upon a definitive explanation. The city's terror was real. The victims were real. The investigations were real. Yet the central figure, the architect of the horror, remains a void, a blank space where a human being should be. There is something uniquely unsettling about faceless predators in historical memory. They deny us psychological closure. They transform from criminals into abstractions, omnipresent, unknowable, impossible to fully confine to the past. Because without a name, without a face, the killer becomes anyone, becomes everywhere, becomes a reminder that some darknesses pass through history without ever being fully illuminated. Cleveland learned to live again, as cities always do. Life resumed its rhythms. Headlines shifted to new crises. Fear gradually lost its immediacy. But mysteries like this do not truly end. They linger at the edges of historical consciousness, resurfacing whenever curiosity drifts backward, whenever someone asks the simplest and most haunting question imaginable. What really happened? Who was responsible? And how did they vanish so completely from certainty? Perhaps the killer died unknown. Perhaps he was questioned and released. Perhaps he walked Cleveland streets long after the murders ceased, indistinguishable from the ordinary citizens passing beside him. Or perhaps the truth is something even more unsettling, that despite all investigations, despite all theories, despite all the decades of retrospective analysis, no one ever truly knew. Cleveland's nightmare did not conclude with resolution. It concluded with silence, and silence, when attached to horror, has a way of echoing far longer than answers ever could. Because the most enduring fear is not the monster we see. It is the one we never do.
Madness and Macabre.